Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Last week saw the release of the first batch of data from the 2021 Census, an absolute goldmine for information about Australia, our population, who we are, what we do, and where we've come from. It can also tell us a lot about where we're going, and for business, this information is priceless. We've spoken to Simon Kuestenmacher, the co-founder of the demographics group, many times since we launched Fear and Greed a couple of years ago. It feels like we've been building to this interview for quite a long time. Our first chat post-census. Simon, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
It's great to be back.
Have you had a great week?
A wonderful week. So it is always the best year in every 5-year block is census data release day.
Wow. It's kind of, we have a regular economist on the show, Stephen Koukoulas, and he loves budget week. Well, this is like 5 times more exciting for a demographer because it's only once every 5 years.
You've done your math correctly, yes.
Yeah. Look, then let's start at the basics. Did the fact that so many people filled out their census online help get that data out faster?
Yes, it did. So we now got census data back less than a year after people filled the census data out. So that is faster than in previous censuses, which is lovely. Also, we had more people fill out the census form. So I think it was 96.1% or thereabouts, which is just a bit more than previously, which of course might have to do with the lockdowns that people were they had a bit of time at their hand.
That's true. So let's look at some of the headline numbers. Australia's population was 25.4 million on census night. Now that's doubled in the past 50 years. How long do you reckon it'll take to double again? I mean, what needs to happen for us to get there?
If we grow our population at pre-census rates, it'll take us 61 years to double again.
Right. And that's probably what will happen?
Most likely. So this will happen, assuming that we will have babies at the relatively low rate that we have them at the moment. That'll probably happen. The question that remains is, will we be able to attract 180,000 net new migrants every year?
Yeah, right.
That, of course, means that the country remains attractive enough for new arrivals. And it just means that we have enough jobs on offer for them.
Okay, I mean, talking about migrants, more than half the Australian population is a first or second generation immigrant now. Is that the first time that's happened?
It wouldn't have been the first time that it happened. If you go way back, there was only the indigenous population that statistically then wasn't counted, which is criminal in its own right. And then you would have just constantly shipped migrants into the country to fill the country up. But it is the first time in a long time since that's the case. Okay. And it really just, I think, runs contradictory to the notion that some people might have that Australia is a racist country. If you throw 25 million people into a country, there will be racist incidents. There will be plenty of horrible incidents that occur. But overall, considering our size, we don't have enough problems considering how multicultural we are. We actually do a great job in integrating people into society. And Australia very much takes on board things that the new arrivals have to offer. And first and foremost, we see this in our cuisine, if you think through this.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, one of the stats we heard last week was about the average Australian. Apparently, it's a woman aged in her 30s in a relationship with children, lives in a greater capital city area and has a weekly family income of about $3,000 or more. How useful is that kind of illustration? Does it really represent much?
It's just a cute little talking point.
Right.
The real big story here is, of course, who is making up the Australian population. So there are plenty of older people, so we are massively growing our older population. So there are now over 5,000 Australians, 100 plus.
Wow.
So that's quite big.
Yeah.
That's the Gold Coast Conference Center, if anyone's counting. But even if we look at the 85 plus population in 15 years' time, it still sounds like a long time away. But in about 15 years' time, we will have 1 million people 85 or older in Australia. And that has ripple down effects to the workforce. We will need so many more aged care workers, nurses, doctors. We are not doing anywhere close to what we need in order to create this workforce. That's a wave of retirement, of care needs that's rolling at us. I think we're not quite aware of how big it will be.
So, I mean, Japan is always held up as the poster child, for want of a better term, for an aging population and a crisis hitting Japan. But that's kind of what's coming towards us in a way. And it's not just aged care, it's also enough working age people to pay taxes, to pay for all that sort of stuff too.
Exactly. So Australia is really well positioned to have a healthy demographic mix, meaning because we just import people of working age at such high rates, we can buffer the workforce requirements. So we can ensure that our workforce still grows. That said, the need for a large enough workforce is also dictated by the large number of people retiring. So the baby boomers over the next decade, they will still be too young overwhelmingly to require a lot of healthcare.
Yep.
But all of a sudden, in like 10, 12 years' time, they will essentially all hit this age bracket where you really need care at high numbers. And then we hopefully are able to look towards Japan and having reshuffled our economy in a way that we have many, many more people in care jobs and that we automated the living hell out of any other sector.
Fair enough. Every point we talk about is the subject of a podcast in itself. So I do apologise to listeners that we are kind of rushing over it. But Simon, we've got 5 years to go through all these. But there are a few things I just want to talk about. What about the number of people who have poor or no command of English? 850,000 people. No, there's not a value judgment in that. There's neither good nor bad. But I often wonder about those people, what it means for their life in Australia if they have poor or no command of English.
Or it just means that you're not fully integrated into the broader society. You will probably be integrated somewhat into your local niche. And that's fair enough. But if you want to run a socially cohesive country, you really need to make sure that everybody speaks the language sufficiently to participate in public life. We can be a bit more generous in saying, well, whatever, so we don't care about first-generation immigrants all that much. But it is absolutely crucial that the second generation speaks English well enough, because otherwise you lock people into generational poverty. You lock people into low-income jobs outside of the main labor market. And that's a nightmare. That's something we don't want. So ensuring that schools teach those disadvantaged kids even more, and they need to start with the basics, with language skills. That's a nightmare for schools. It's a big ask of schools. So ideally, we can minimize this. And theoretically, we could minimize this by tightening certain kind of visa language testing requirements a bit more.
Stay with me, Simon. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Simon Kuestenmacher, co-founder of the Demographics Group. The number of people identifying as Indigenous jumped really sharply. I think it was up 25% on the previous census data. Why?
That's actually my favorite statistic so far out of the census. This big increase of population that self-identifies as Indigenous isn't by any means driven by a high birth rate. This is just that we created an environment in Australia where more and more people feel loud and proud enough, feel confident, feel safe enough that they can publicly, if you will, declare their heritage. That's really nice.
That's a great thing.
And I think that's a healthy sign. We are not asking for your sexual preference in the census, but I'm convinced that the number of people who would identify as LGBTQI+, that this number would have risen as well.
Yeah.
So we are just really good at creating a welcoming environment for everyone. You'll see this at the moment with the trans discussion, that some people feel excluded and some people say we're still not where we needed to be. Whatever it is, I don't care about the status quo. I always care about the past and the future. I care about the trends. And we're moving into a more open and accepting direction.
Okay. Now, this was the first census to collect information on diagnosed long-term health conditions. I was amazed that 2.2 million people reported having a mental health condition, but many people reported having long-term health conditions and chronic healthcare conditions.
Absolutely. And it's a really exciting addition to the data set. Some people say, it's a bit difficult to ask this question because some people might essentially self-diagnose a bit of asthma to themselves when they don't technically have it. But that's not the interesting story. The interesting story is that we can now cross-tabulate healthcare data with socioeconomic data, with geographic data. And this really points us to why we run a census in the first place. It's not just so that people like I are interested, I'm happy because I can just find out interesting stuff. We want to improve the lives of the Australian people with the census. And you can then better target where infrastructure is placed when you know where people live. But you can most importantly now better target healthcare services. You can understand for the first time really what drives mental health. So it takes until October until the detailed data is released. But then we can find out, could we argue that weather, that sunshine improves your mental health?
Yeah.
What's the socioeconomic impact on mental health? We can now actually come up with retail settings regarding this, which is just wonderful.
And so, how do we get to the point of, I'm feeling like a bit of a fool here, Simon. How do you do that? How do you cross-tabulate all this information?
The Australian census is run every 5 years and it asks 65 questions. You can cross-tabulate the answer from one question with the answer of another question. And so you essentially have an endlessly large matrix of data that you can fill out. And this data is being made available in a tool. It's called Table Builder for researchers. And so you essentially tell the little machine what kind of data table you would like to have. And then the little machine thinks a bit and it spits the table out for you, which is crazy. It is just such a good tool. And no other country besides maybe Singapore and New Zealand and maybe Canada have an equally good census. The Americans, for example, run a census every 10 years and they ask 14 questions. So we are orders of magnitude better than anything that comes out of Europe or the US. We really can understand and can research what the Australian peoples think, where they are, what they are like. And we all do this not on just vague, wishy-washy survey data, but we do this on hard factual data in a census. So that's pretty cool stuff.
Which comes back to your base point that this information allows us to think about aged care, allows us to think about resourcing mental health care, allows us to think about how Australia is going to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years.
Exactly. And just those past trends and then add a bit of our future forecasting, which is actually fairly simple in Australia because we dictate how many people come into the country. It's easy to forecast the future with really high precision, 10, 20 years. So it's really not a lack of data, a lack of understanding that leads to a lack of adequate infrastructure. It leads to a lack of adequate, aged care services, for example. But is it a political will? Is it just political feasibility of those tasks? But at least the census gives us a fighting chance to improve the country.
Simon, thank you for talking to me fair and great. I'm sure over the next couple of years, I hope over the next couple of years, you'll be available and we can go through all these different aspects of it because, as I mentioned, every single point can be it's like an onion. You can just peel back again and again and again and get so much out of it.
Well, I'm happy to chat demographics any time of the day.
Simon, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed. That was Simon Kuestenmacher, co-founder of the Demographics Group. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Remember, you should get professional advice before making any investment decisions. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.